Make sure that you study and understand the learning objectives. Variable costs are the same per unit and they vary with volume. If in this example, it's 50 cents for the variable cost, the cost of the coffee beans, and it's 50 cents a cup, and with the number of drinks, the total variable costs then increase. Fixed costs are just the opposite. They're fixed in total and they vary by unit, and the more units, the less per unit they cost. Step costs have a fixed and a variable component, or they can. The one on the left has a variable component and a fixed component, and you can see it step its way up as the volume increases. And the one on the right is fixed through about 6,000 drinks, and then it increases to the next plateau, and it then stays flat again, and which is why it's important to remember that the when we analyze and use cost behavior to make business decisions, that we're doing it within a relevant range. So if we look at the graph on the right, the relevant range is 0 to 6,000 drinks and 6,000 to 10,000 plus, whatever the end is. And we just have to remember that. Mixed costs have a portion of both, and we can see on the left, total mixed costs increase with volume, but not at the same steepness as variable costs, and mixed costs per unit decreases, volume increases. There is a linear assumption that total cost it's a straight line. It's total fixed cost plus variable costs per unit times activity. We see the graph there. There are 3 different methods to analyze mixed costs, all using the linear assumption as a base. You can do it with a scatter graph, high-low, or least squares regression. Here is a set of data. And if we create a scatter graph in Excel, you can see it and make sure you study both how to do it and the result. But you can see this total overhead costs right here. High-low, we can actually sort the data in to get the high and the low values. And once we get the high and the low, we take the difference in total cost and the difference in total activity. And we use the formula. And then we can calculate and graph the fixed costs and the variable costs. That gives us an estimate of the portion of the mixed costs that's each. Here is the math. Least squares regression adds a trend line to the scatter graph. And there's the math. Multiple regression, make sure you follow through and make sure you understand how that works in Excel. Here is the math for the least squares regression method. Here's the summary of the methods. Make sure you know how they differ and that you can calculate the amount of variable and fixed costs with all 3 methods. Here's an income statement, a contribution margin income statement. So in this case, we have $5 of contribution margin, or $4 per unit, and it's 80% of sales. Here is contribution margin income statement for the month of March. Make sure you study that. Make sure you study the ratios and understand the math. Full absorption versus variable costing. It's important to understand that. GAAP requires full absorption costing for external reporting, so certainly companies use that. But variable costing can be used for internal decision making, and it's very intuitive, I think. Cost classifications for full absorption, we classify as manufacturing versus non-manufacturing. And for variable costing, it's variable versus fixed. The income statement formula for full absorption is sales less cost of goods sold equals gross margin less non-manufacturing expenses, equals net operating income. For variable costing, it's sales less variable cost equals contribution margin less fixed expenses equals net operating income. Cost of goods sold equals manufacturing cost per unit times units sold. Full absorption, the treatment of fixed manufacturing overhead is divided between cost of goods sold and ending inventory. And for variable costing, it's expense during the period incurred. We can reconcile the two methods. Make sure you know how to do that. Full absorption costing and variable costing income statements, they're different. And we can reconcile the difference. So as usual, I move past the charts and graphs and the math and statements and make sure, because like I continue to say, and I'll remind you, you won't understand it until you can trace it through yourself and it makes sense. And I can tell you, but you need to figure that out so that it makes sense for you.